I knew something was off the minute I saw the disco lights flashing through the cracks of my old barn at 2 in the morning. I live on the edge of a semi-rural neighborhood where most folks mind their business. Except for Sylvia Granger, president of the HOA, self-appointed neighborhood sheriff, and full-time pain in the rear. Sylvia's the kind of woman who files noise complaints if your wind chimes are too cheerful. The kind of person who leaves passive-aggressive notes about lawn height. And somehow, she's managed to stay in power for 5 years straight because no one wants to deal with her tantrums. I'm Porter McCrae, carpenter, veteran, and very much allergic to nonsense. I've got a few acres out here, including an old red barn that's been empty since my dad passed. I keep it locked up, but I guess the padlock's more of a suggestion than a rule when you're Sylvia Granger. So when I saw flickering lights and heard the unmistakable thump of bass from my supposedly empty barn, I grabbed my flashlight and keys. Halfway across the yard, the ground was vibrating like I was walking into a club. I swung open the barn doors and there it was.
A rave.
In my barn. Neon lights. Fog machine. A full DJ setup. At least 30 people, most in their 40s and 50s, dancing like it was 1997. And right in the middle of it, wearing glitter boots and a tiara, was Sylvia Granger herself. I yelled over the music, "Sylvia, what the hell are you doing in my barn?" She didn't even flinch. Just turned, flicked her hair, and said, "Oh, calm down, Porter. It's for the community. You weren't using it. You broke into my property. It's not breaking in if it's for the neighborhood," she said, sipping from a red cup like she hadn't just admitted to a felony. I left before I did something I'd regret. Went straight back to my house, called my cousin Trevor, who just so happens to be the county sheriff. "Trevor," I said calmly, "you're gonna want to bring a couple deputies. The HOA president's throwing a rave in my barn." There was a pause on the line. Then, "You serious?" "Completely." 10 minutes later, I was standing in my driveway, arms crossed, as sheriff cruisers lined up along the fence line. The music cut off mid-beat when the first flashlight beams hit the barn walls. People started scrambling like roaches. Sylvia tried to sneak out the side door, but got caught by one of the deputies. "Ma'am," Trevor said, "you're trespassing on private property, operating without a permit, and there's open alcohol. You know better." She tried to play it off. "This is a community event. I'm the HOA president." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't make you above the law." Sylvia's face twisted. "I have rights. Not on someone else's land, you don't." They cuffed her right there in front of the barn she broke into. She screamed about unlawful arrest and abuse of power, while the rest of her rave crew ducked out like busted teenagers. As she was loaded into the back of the cruiser, she shouted at me, "This isn't over, Porter. You'll regret this." I just watched her go, shaking my head. Lady forgot one important thing. You don't mess with the McCrae's land. Especially when his cousin's the sheriff. The following morning started quiet, eerily so. No lawnmowers, no yapping dogs, no joggers waving their usual half-hearted greetings. Just a thick fog hanging low over the fields and a silence that felt too deliberate to be natural. I brewed my coffee and stepped out onto the porch, watching as the mist crawled across the gravel road that cut through our neighborhood like a scar. By 8 o'clock, Sheriff Trevor called. She refused bail. "She what?" said she's making a statement. "Claims this is political." I let out a low whistle. She always did have a flair for drama, but this is a whole new level. Trevor sighed. She's already called 2 local papers and a podcast host in Atlanta. Says you're part of some anti-civic group trying to dismantle the HOA system from within. Does she even hear herself when she talks? Apparently not. Brace yourself. This isn't over. He wasn't wrong. By noon, someone had stacked folding chairs in the cul-de-sac and set up a table with pastries and a sign that read "Committee for Sylvia's Return." I recognized the ringleader right away, Walt Mosley, a retired insurance adjuster with a permanent scowl and a garage full of surveillance drones. He waved a clipboard at passing cars like he was campaigning for public office. I walked down, coffee mug in hand. "Walt," I said, "you're seriously organizing a rally for someone who broke into private property?" He didn't look up from his clipboard. "Sylvia's done more for this neighborhood than anyone. Sidewalk pressure washing, monthly newsletters, the garden competition. She threw a party in my barn without permission." He paused, pen hovering mid-air. "It was a miscommunication." "You really believe that?" He tapped his pen twice on the clipboard. "Some of us think you overreacted. You could have just told her no. Didn't need to involve the sheriff." "She broke a lock." He shrugged. "Locks can be replaced. Trust? That's harder." I stared at him for a moment, then turned and walked away. No sense arguing with someone who thinks trespassing is a character-building exercise. That evening, I got a knock at the door. It wasn't a neighbor or some clipboard warrior. It was Dana Patel, assistant district attorney. "Porter," she said, brushing raindrops off her blazer. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside and let her in. She looked tired, like she'd been reading too many files and not sleeping enough. "I was reviewing the incident report," she said, settling onto the edge of the couch. "There's more to this than a rave." "Figured as much. What did you find?" "There's a paper trail. Sylvia filed a maintenance request with the county last month, claimed your barn was a public nuisance and needed to be reappropriated for civic use." My jaw tensed. "She tried to seize it?" She cited an obscure municipal clause from 1978 about abandoned structures. But the thing is, that clause only applies to city-owned buildings, not privately held property. So she knew she had no claim. "She knew," Dana nodded. "And she filed it anyway. Then she staged an event inside it to make it seem like it was already designated for public use." My hands curled into fists. "That's not a miscommunication. That's premeditated." Dana reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. "The county zoning board's launching an internal review. But I'm preparing charges falsifying government documents, unlawful entry, and attempted misuse of public policy for personal gain." I exhaled slowly. "That's a mouthful. It's also a felony." "Good."
Dana stood.
"You'll probably be contacted for a formal statement. And I get used to cameras. This is going to be a story." She was right again. By the next morning, a news van was parked near the mailbox, and a skinny reporter in a windbreaker was trying to look casual while filming intros with my barn in the background. I stayed inside. Let them zoom in on the faded paint and rusted hinges if they wanted. I had nothing to hide. The real surprise came on the fourth day when Sylvia was released on bond and came straight to the HOA office. Not to apologize. Not to resign. To double down. She held a press conference in the parking lot using a karaoke mic and a borrowed PA system. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she wore a blazer like she was about to testify before Congress. "I have always acted in the interest of our community," she declared. "This is a targeted campaign against civic engagement. They want to silence your voice." Someone in the crowd, a teenager on a skateboard, shouted, "You threw a rave in a barn." Sylvia ignored him. "I will not be intimidated by manufactured charges or manipulated narratives. Justice is on our side." I watched from across the street, leaning against my truck. A few neighbors glanced my way, uncertain. Others just looked uncomfortable. The crowd wasn't big, maybe 24, but it was enough to tell me she still had influence. That changed the next morning, because that's when the audit results came in. Trevor called me again, this time sounding amused. "Guess what the county forensic accountant found?" "Gonna guess it's worse than a few fake forms. Tried $27,000 in unaccounted HOA funds." I whistled. 15 invoices for community improvement projects that were never completed. 3 checks made out to cash. And get this, she paid a DJ service under a fake name. Claimed it was for a community sound system upgrade. Please tell me you're arresting her again. Already did. She didn't even get to finish her coffee. Hours later, the HOA office was locked up with caution tape, and an official notice was tacked to the door. Closed pending investigation. Walt Mosley tried to rally another clipboard brigade, but when the financials hit the local news, even his cronies backed off. By sunset, half the neighborhood was outside, sharing stories. Turns out Sylvia had been bending rules for years, fining people for non-existent violations, using HOA dues to pay for landscaping on her own property. She even charged a neighbor for a fence height infraction when his dog jumped too high during playtime. People were angry, but more than that, they were embarrassed. They'd let her run things unchecked for too long. They were ready for change. That night, I stood at the edge of my porch again, watching the stars blink to life over the dark silhouette of the barn. It still needed repairs, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was guarding it alone. The next HOA meeting was already scheduled, but this time it wouldn't be held in Sylvia's living room. It'd be at the local rec center, with open ballots and new names on the slate. And me? I wasn't running for president. I just offered to build the ballot box. Out of oak, with a lock no one could pick. 3 days after the audit shut down the HOA office, a flatbed truck arrived unannounced and parked outside Sylvia's house. A man in a thick flannel shirt and steel-toe boots stepped down, glanced at a clipboard, and began unloading boxes labeled Evidence Audit Unit. I watched from the sidewalk as he and a deputy from the County Records Division wheeled them up her driveway and into what used to be her sunroom. The blinds were drawn, but the sound of drawers being opened and files being shuffled echoed faintly into the street. By the time they left, the entire neighborhood had shifted. Lawns that Sylvia used to nitpick suddenly grew wild with rebellion. Neighbors who once whispered complaints behind fences were now openly talking about establishing a new civic charter. The fear was gone, replaced by something more potent: curiosity. Everyone wanted to know how deep her hands had been in things. I had just finished sanding a new oak bench when Deputy Cole pulled into my driveway, rolled his window down, and said, "You got a minute?" I brushed sawdust off my hands and walked over. "What now?" He leaned on the steering wheel. "We've got a situation. You're probably going to want to hear it from us before it ends up on the 6 o'clock news." "Go on." We searched Sylvia's computer. She had a second set of books encrypted. IT cracked it yesterday. Turns out, she was running a shell company using HOA funds. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of shell company? Something called Granger Civic Ventures. On paper, it was registered as a nonprofit for community betterment projects. In practice, she used it to funnel money into personal investments, real estate, stock options, even a vacation rental in Asheville. I stepped back. She committed wire fraud using HOA dues. Among other things, there's an email string between her and a contractor she hired under the table claims she paid him to fabricate invoices. He's already flipped. Gave a full statement. Is the DA charging her again? They're escalating. It's federal now. Treasury and postal inspectors are involved. Dana's coordinating with a couple of agents out of Atlanta. I let out a breath long and low. She thought she was untouchable. Cole nodded. And now she's facing a stack of charges that would make a hedge fund manager sweat. By the time he pulled away, word had already begun to spread. Paper notices started appearing under mailboxes, official ones, stamped by the county, notifying residents of the frozen HOA accounts. Utility reimbursements were suspended. Landscaping contracts were on hold. And a forensic team was combing through every HOA meeting minute from the past 3 years. That evening, I walked over to the home of Roland and Jeanette Lively, the oldest couple on our block. Jeanette opened the door with a worried look in her eyes and ushered me in without a word. Roland sat at the kitchen table with a manila envelope in front of him, hands folded tight. "She made us sign something," he said before I could ask. "Last year, when we applied for the fence permit. Said it was just routine paperwork." I opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of legal documents. One was a deed amendment. My stomach turned. "She added a clause," I said. "This gives the HOA partial easement rights over your side yard. That's why she approved the fence." She tied it to a land agreement. Jeanette shook her head. "We didn't understand it. She said it was just a new policy." I took a photo of the documents and sent them to Dana immediately. Within the hour, she called back. "She's been doing this to multiple homeowners, quietly modifying property lines through deceptive paperwork. We've found 6 cases so far where she coerced elderly residents into signing easement agreements that gave her leverage over their lots. Can you reverse it?" "Already filed motions. But Porter, this is bigger than just fraud. It's elder exploitation." That's a whole different charge. The next morning, 2 unmarked government vehicles parked in Sylvia's driveway. Agents in navy windbreakers retrieved hard drives, ledgers, and a dusty filing cabinet from her garage. They didn't knock. They had a warrant. She wasn't there. After her second arrest, she'd posted bond again, this time quietly, through an out-of-state attorney. But she hadn't returned home. Instead, she'd holed up in a motel 2 towns over, where she was supposedly recovering from stress. Cameras caught her sneaking out later that afternoon with a suitcase. What she didn't know was that the suitcase was being tracked. The DA's office had planted a GPS beacon inside it. They suspected she might try to flee the state. She made it as far as the on-ramp to the interstate before a swarm of patrol cars boxed her in. Her face, tense and pale, showed up on every local news broadcast by evening. A grainy photo of her in handcuffs, sunglasses askew, became the symbol of the entire scandal. That night, the neighborhood gathered unofficially in front of what used to be the HOA clubhouse, really just a converted 2-car garage attached to the house of one of her loyalists. No one went inside. Instead, people stood in a loose circle under porch lights and garage floods, talking in low tones. I saw faces I hadn't seen in years. Mr. Kim from 3 doors down, who once got fined for having a flagpole 2 inches taller than regulation. Marnie, the florist who'd been told her flower boxes were too visually chaotic. Even the Morgans, a young couple who'd moved in last year and had nearly sold their place after getting hit with a bogus paint color violation. People started sharing stories. Not complaints, details. Evidence. Documents they'd kept, fines they'd paid, letters they'd received that never felt right. Someone passed around a folder of photos showing Sylvia's backyard being resodded by the same landscaping crew paid by the HOA to service only public spaces. I didn't speak until near the end. When the group had gone quiet, I said, "It's not just about what she did. It's about how long she got away with it. That ends now." No one clapped. They didn't need to. The next day, we held a special vote under emergency provision. Dana helped us draft the new charter, one that would dissolve the current HOA and replace it with a resident committee elected by actual ballot, with term limits and transparency requirements. No more lifetime presidencies. No more secret budgets. We used the oak ballot box I built. Heavy, clean, with a brass latch that clicked tight when closed. Every single resident voted. When the final count was read aloud, not a single vote had been cast for keeping the old system. Sylvia was indicted on 12 counts. 3 federal, the rest state level. Her trial was scheduled for the following season, but she never made it that far. Her lawyer arranged a plea deal in exchange for full restitution and a permanent ban from serving in any civic leadership position again. She sold her house to cover part of the settlement. The new owners? A retired firefighter and his wife, a children's librarian. The first thing they did was remove the massive HOA president plaque from the mailbox. The plaque now sits in my workshop, nailed to the side of my tool cabinet. Not as a trophy. As a reminder, power's only dangerous when people stop watching. 2 weeks after Sylvia accepted the plea deal, I got a certified letter in the mail from the county clerk's office. Not a summons, not this time, but a formal invitation to testify before the Civic Oversight Panel regarding proposed reforms to how homeowner associations were regulated throughout the county. Apparently, the storm she stirred up had reached higher than any of us expected. I had barely finished reading the letter when my neighbor, Hugo Alvarez, stepped onto my porch holding what looked like a 3-inch binder. "Porter," he said, adjusting his glasses, "you got a minute?" I nodded and motioned him inside. Hugo was a quiet man, retired engineer, meticulous to a fault. He set the binder down on my kitchen table and flipped it open. "These are copies of architectural approval forms from the last 5 years. I used to sit on the HOA design subcommittee until Sylvia replaced us all." "You kept records?" He nodded, tapping a tab marked alterations. "She overrode every single vote we made. Look here, this deck extension was denied because it violated the rear setback limit. 2 weeks later, it was approved under her signature after the homeowner paid an expedited compliance fee. That fee was never recorded in the official minutes." I turned the page slowly. She was running a private racket inside a public system. There's more. These documents never made it to the county registry. She kept everything off book. I leaned back in my chair. "You mind if I take this with me to the panel?" "That's why I brought it." He stood to leave, hesitated, then said, "You think she ever really believed she was helping the neighborhood?" "No," I said, closing the binder. "I think she believed she was the neighborhood." The Civic Oversight Panel met in a beige municipal building downtown. The air inside smelled like toner and old carpet. I wasn't the only one called to speak. There were 6 of us, each with our own stack of documentation. The panel of 5 county officials sat behind a long oak table, flanked by 2 legal advisors and a court reporter. When it was my turn, I stood, placed Hugo's binder on the table, and said, "This isn't just about mismanagement. It's about unchecked authority. The system let her operate in the dark. We need daylight." The chairwoman, a sharp-eyed woman named Marla Dorsey, asked, "What would you recommend?" "Mandatory audits every year, transparent elections, term limits, and real consequences when policy is abused. The HOA board should never be more powerful than the people who live under it." They asked questions for another 20 minutes. I answered every one. 2 weeks later, the panel issued a resolution that would change how homeowner associations operated in the county: mandatory disclosure of all financial records, rotating leadership elections, and county oversight for any disciplinary action involving fines over $500. It passed unanimously. By the time the new rules went into effect, the old HOA charter had been formally dissolved. The district court approved the formation of a new neighborhood council and advisory body without the ability to fine or enforce. Just neighbors helping neighbors. We held the first meeting in the community garden, under a string of borrowed party lights. No titles. No power trips. Just folding chairs and potluck casseroles. Hugo was named treasurer. Marnie volunteered to manage communications. I declined any official position, but agreed to build a new bulletin board, a real one this time, not the locked plexiglass box Sylvia used to post citations in. Not long after, I received a call from a federal investigator named Delaney. She was wrapping up the multi-agency probe into Sylvia's shell company. "She's forfeiting the Asheville property," Delaney said. "It's being liquidated to pay restitution. There's also a retirement account she tried to hide under a cousin's name. We traced it." I nodded into the phone. "So she's not walking away from this. She'll serve time. Not just for fraud, also for elder coercion and document forgery. Minimum of 8 years, no parole." I thanked her and hung up. The barn sat empty for a while after all that. I finally got around to fixing the roofline and replacing the warped siding. Then one afternoon, a flyer went up on the new bulletin board. Hugo's granddaughter was starting a 4-H group and needed a place to host their first animal showcase. They asked if they could use the barn. This time, I said yes. The day of the event, families filled the field with lawn chairs and lemonade coolers. Kids paraded goats and rabbits through the grass while parents clapped and took photos. No fog machines, no neon lights. Just laughter, fresh hay, and the creak of old barn doors swinging gently in the breeze. Trevor stopped by in uniform, leaned on the fence, and said, "You ever think it'd come full circle like this?" "Not exactly," I said, handing him a lemonade. "But I'll take it." One of the kids, a wiry boy with a grin too big for his face, ran up and asked if he could store his rabbit hutch in the barn till next week. I nodded and unlocked the door for him. As he ran off, Trevor glanced at the padlock. "That the same one she cut?" "No," I said. "That one's in a bag of evidence. This one's newer, stronger, and welded to a steel plate." "Smart. Learn my lesson." He took a sip of his drink and looked out over the field. "You think she'll ever come back?" I shook my head. "Not as long as this community remembers what happened. And I have a feeling they will." A breeze rolled through, bringing with it the faint scent of sawdust and clover. The barn stood tall behind us, no longer a symbol of trespass, but of restoration. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line and the last of the folding chairs were packed away, I locked the barn and walked back to the porch. The new bulletin board caught the last of the light, its glass polished and clean. A fresh notice had been posted. Hugo's granddaughter was organizing a donation drive for the local animal shelter. No one had to approve it. No one had to sign a form or pay a fee. It was just happening. Because that's what real community looks like. Not control. Not fear. Just people, finally free to live without someone watching their every move. And that, more than anything, was the justice Sylvia never saw coming.